All right. Well, thank you very much, Bob Willard, for joining me this afternoon. It's great to see you.
Likewise, it's always a treat.
Thanks. And you know a little bit more than some about what this is about to entail. Just before we jump into the questions I've teed up, I wanted to ask you to introduce yourself in whatever way you'd like to share with the world.
Oh, sure. Okay, so I'm just me. I'm a sole proprietor. I'm the founder of Sustainability Advantage, which is a little organization that produces tools, resources for people that are trying to do good stuff, especially with the business community. So I write books, I create resources, mostly Excel resources, tools, write a couple of white papers and do a lot of talks. I don't actually do consulting the way most people think of consulting. Mostly what I do is talks for colleges, universities, conferences, companies, to try to help them see possibilities that maybe they didn't see before. I've been doing this for about 20 years. Before that, I had a previous life in IBM Canada, which was fantastic as well. But I'm having a lot of fun undertaking some fairly major challenges on the sustainability front.
Terrific. And I'll also just disclose in the spirit of transparency how you and I are connected. And I feel like you were one of the first mentors for me back when I worked at CBSR. I think we all at the team at Canadian Business for Social Responsibility looked to you for guidance and inspiration, got all your books. We're happy to host you and find you at talks. And since then, I feel extremely grateful that you've been a very generous mentor to me, just one-on-one in my writing journey and my learning journey. So I feel like you're one of my most important trusted mentors. So I'm very grateful.
Right back at you, right back at you. You're the one that got me connected to the Future Fit Business Benchmark exercise. And you are a connector. You're fantastic. And thank you for that.
Wow. Well, thank you. I'm very honored. And also just in the spirit of transparency, before we go into questions about TD Bank, just to check if you have any commercial relationship with the bank.
No, and I should probably go a little further. I don't have any commercial or any kind of connection to any of the Canadian banks. And that's intentional. I used to, but I decided maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I guess, that my values were more aligned with credit unions than they were with banks. At that time, I was doing all of my banking with the Royal Bank. So had my parents. So I just kind of went with them. Yep. But as I got more and more into all of this stuff, the sustainability stuff, the importance of values started to be a little bit more on my radar screen than they had been before. And I decided that I wanted to move to credit unions. So I've got 2 credit unions that I do business with. I insure through the cooperators. It just feels better.
Interesting. Lots more I want to talk about there, but I'm going to pull us into the script a little bit here. But thank you for clarifying that. And as you know, this materiality exercise is really geared to have a look at whether or not a company, in this case TD Bank, is contributing to the future we want, or if they're undermining the future we want. And one of the things I find really important to understand is, what do others think the future we want actually is? We hear a lot about sustainable development, regenerative economy, all kinds of phrases get thrown around, future fitness, of course. I'd love to hear in your own words, what is the future you want?
Yeah, so at one point I needed to put together a vision statement for my organization because I put out an annual report on how I'm doing on this stuff, and a purpose and a vision and a mission statement were things that I thought were appropriate for that. So because I'm a sole proprietor, the vision for the organization is pretty much my vision. And what I'm looking for is really a sustainable world in which people and businesses flourish within nature's limits. So a little bit of natural step kind of flavor in there about nature's limits and so on. and science-based ways of describing what those are. But basically that the blueprint that's been laid out by the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN SDGs, actually happen. Because it's not bad, there are 17 things there, and we could pick at a couple of them and think that they could be better expressed, but as a set of environmental and social kinds of things, it's a pretty good list of things that we need to pay attention to and make sure are in the right position for all of us to have a really good time.
Nice, thank you. And so if you will, hold that vision, which I think you do anyway, much more than most on a day-to-day basis. If you can hold that vision as a kind of thought bubble for the questions that in the background of the questions I'm about to ask, because as we explore TD Bank's current activities or even banking more broadly, and we talked a bit about this, if some of the responses make more sense to be less specific to TD Bank, what we're really looking to compare to is in relation to that future you want. And so with that, we'll jump into the TD specific questions. And I'd like to start with your thoughts on the positive impacts that the bank is having, or banking more broadly, in delivering on that future you want. So where would you see examples of activities, impacts that are happening that deliver on that future we want? Yeah, I'll pause there. What's working well?
Yeah, well, if you want to hear their side of the story, their reports are pretty explicit on the things that they're proud of, the things that they're investing in, the diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI side, really trying to clean up their own act and encourage their clients to do the same on that. They're making money available to some good things as well. They're funding some good things. So on the energy side and the climate side, they are investing in some projects that look like they are going in the right direction. So the way they treat their employees, as far as I can tell, is pretty good. So when you think of the people and planet stuff, because it's a bank, they're not making steel, they're not manufacturing stuff. So a lot of the footprint associated with those kinds of activities isn't something that they have to worry about. And in terms of greenhouse gases internally, they are trying to reduce their own greenhouse gases from their own locations, their own operations, and that's all good. So, they're working on things that you would expect a bank to work on. Of course, they could always do a heck of a lot more and do more of the stuff that Van City does as well in terms of community investment and so on. But they're doing some good stuff.
You know what's coming next. What about on the flip side, when you think about activities that the bank is responsible for that might be undermining that future that you just described?
Well, as you and I know, the biggest issue that we're facing right now is the urgency of the climate crisis. And I am very distressed that they are nowhere close to where they should be on that file. They are still supporting much, much more than they should or could the extraction of fossil fuels and the transportation of fossil fuels, because they invest quite a lot in Enbridge as well. So, their investments in pipelines, their investments in the tar sands, which you'd think would be easing off with all of the heat that everybody's getting on climate change these days, so to speak. But they're not. I mean, their investments in the tar sands went up last year. Now, when you take a look at the analysis of where the funding for the fossil fuel sector is coming from, there are 3 Canadian banks that are in the top 12, or the worst 12, that are still funding the extraction of fossil fuels and the exploration for fossil fuels, for goodness sakes. And that's Royal Bank, and let me just see the list here. Scotiabank and TD. TD is 12th. The Royal Bank is at the top, unfortunately. But you say, well, okay, maybe they're providing them with money for the transition, this infamous transition. Say, well, not so much, actually. They may try to code it that way, but when you drill down a little bit, it's not hard to find that basically they're supporting business as usual for a fossil fuel company.
Yeah.
So that's really disappointing, and it's unnecessary. It's just it offsets so much of the good stuff that they're doing. They're extremely profitable. All the banks are. In fact, they compete with each other to be the most profitable for all the usual reasons. And it's motivating them to continue to invest in a sector that that is taking us in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So I'm very concerned about them, all the banks, all the Canadian banks. There are bad actors in other jurisdictions as well, especially Europe and in the States. But man, it's embarrassing that Canadian banks are so slow. And then you read the reports, and the reports make it look like they really do give a hoot about this stuff. I mean, they've signed on to all of the declarations and so on, and science-based targets and all that stuff. And then you peel down a little bit on their methodology as to how you'd know it if you saw it in terms of their goals and targets and so on. And they've got internal targets for 2025, nothing for 2030. So you say, well, let's see now. Science-based targets. It seems to me that the last time the IPCC came out with their science-based targets as to what they should be, it's reducing your greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. But that first date is kind of important. So how are they doing on their 2030 deadline? So they've reduced their carbon footprint internally, scope 1 and 2, by 20-some%, 25%, I guess, by 2025. That's their current goal. But nothing for going the next 25% by 2030. And when you talk about all the companies they invest in, which is really the acid test for a bank, their portfolio, lots of commitments for the 2050 deadline, but not much for the 2030 deadline. In fact, I think the best estimate is that they are shooting for 29% reduction from their current greenhouse gas emissions from their portfolio by 2030. You say 29, what happened to 50? You know?
Yeah.
So that's all the stuff that you read in terms of their commitment and their rhetoric and their website, their reports and so on, makes it sound like they really, really, really care. And then I just wish there were more evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, I follow. And what about
other than that, though, I really don't have a strong opinion on whether
yeah, just that one detail of fueling our rapid, demise. And in all seriousness, beyond that, although that is obviously a really big one around the financing of the fossil fuel infrastructure of the world, are there other concerns that come to mind in terms of undermining that future that you described?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about corporate purpose and the need for a multi-stakeholder purpose. So the Business Roundtable in 2019 came out with some pretty good guidance on what the corporate purpose should be, what it shouldn't be, which is maximize shareholder wealth and so on. I'm not sure whether the bank has paid much attention to that. I wish I could see somewhere where they say, yeah, we really do believe in multi-stakeholder and all that good stuff as our purpose, and we're going to walk the talk on that. But even if they did, it would be nice if the if the stakeholders were inclusive of more than just shareholders and customers and so on.
Yeah.
So who's in your shareholder mix, the stakeholder mix rather, and who would, if you were having a boardroom layout with name tags in front of people, what would be the name tags that you would like to see at the boardroom table? And as you know, I'm part of the faculty of the Directors College, and sometimes when I do the module on ESG, we talk about those labels. So sometimes I say, well, if you were to kind of put out name tags, you probably have one for shareholders, because that's kind of traditional. You might have one for customers, which would be kind of cool too, because they're very important stakeholders. You might have some for suppliers, who are more and more important now because you're accountable for their impacts. Having some internal stakeholders like employees at the table, a little radical for some organizations, but some of them are ready for it.
Yeah.
Then you might have some from your communities, either your headquarters community or local communities, just to make sure that your impacts on them are appropriate. But do we also have a place for future generations? Where is the voice for them, the future generations? And then lastly, where's the voice for Mother Nature?
Yeah.
And if we think it's an NGO, that's not what I'm talking about. I mean Mother Nature, not somebody that thinks they represent her. Who is paying attention to the signals that we're getting from Mother Nature? She has a different voice, but she has a voice. And we are doing an amazing job of ignoring that voice at our own peril. And I really think that if a bank like the TD Bank were to embrace a multi-stakeholder purpose, it would be kind of important for them to acknowledge that they accept Mother Nature, the environment, as a stakeholder, and future generations as a stakeholder. That would be a very good signal.
Yeah. Oh, I'm having this, I'll just sort of break the fourth wall for a moment, or whatever the term is, where one of the stakeholders I've been trying to figure out to interview for this assessment is some element of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River Basin, and actually how to directly engage with the waterways. It's tricky, like, to ask the St. Lawrence River to dial into a Zoom call. But I think when I think of a Canadian bank, and I think that this country has more fresh water than any other country in the world, when I think of the fact that almost all of our human population is based along waterways, and, you know, where is the voice of the waterways? Yeah, it's a gap. So,
well, if anybody can figure out how to work their voice into an interview, you can. So start with the trees, and then work on the waterways.
Well, thanks. I'm working on it. Actually, in follow-up to this, I'll send you a link to the interview from the Google assessment, where Ricardo Cardim, who really is a human representative of the Atlantic forest in Brazil, he joined a conversation, and it was really, really helpful. So I'm trying to find the sort of Ricardo Cardim of the St. Lawrence River. I've been asking the river every morning, but I digress. Thank you for those insights. Really, really helpful to hear your thoughts. And keep that insight wheel rolling, as I'm about to take us into another question that builds on that. So I'm going to share my screen here. Just give me a moment to see if I can work the technology. Let me know when you see a slide with your name on it. Are you seeing a Google slide there?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly walk you through what's happening here, and you will know better than most people in the world the lack of usefulness of a 2x2 matrix in an effort to make sense of highly complex, interconnected information. But we're gonna humor the exercise anyway. So what's happening here is, on the horizontal axis, we've got impacts on societal health. And anything to the left of the line is negatively impacting or undermining that future that you talked about in relation to society. Anything to the right of the line is contributing to it in some way. And then likewise, on the vertical axis, we've got impact on ecosystem health. Anything below The midline here is undermining that future that you described in relation to the ecosystems. Anything above the line is contributing in some way. And so what I was going to ask you to do is over here, way on the right, you see a little bubble that is TD Bank. And I'd like to ask you to tell me where to place it and why. And I'll just reiterate, this is a completely foolish errand with no right answer. And you have the option to tell me to put multiple bubbles in multiple places and why. And so from there, I'll stop talking and just see what you tell me to do with this bubble.
So the vertical axis is the ecosystem health?
That's right. Yeah.
So -4 on that one.
Mm-hmm.
And impact on social health is the horizontal one.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a derivative of ecosystem health, it's hard not to have it on the negative side as well. Probably not as far, maybe a 3, -3.
Mm-hmm. So maybe about there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And mostly, as I say, driven by the impact of climate change on so many of the 19 ecosystem services that we are dependent on as a human race.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're dependent on them as a human race, that affects our social health.
Right.
So water, soil, climate change, biodiversity, goodness, there are so many things that are connected to the ripple effect of climate change that it's hard not to acknowledge there are social impacts as well. Without that, the social would be a lot more neutral, but neutral in the sense that they're not doing much. They're not doing as much good as maybe they could, or as a credit union might in Van City. But I don't know if they're doing harm. I don't know. Think about that. Anyway,
Okay.
that's where I would put them, mostly driven by my concern about climate change.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you for humoring that. Actually, just while we're here, it prompts another question for me, which is you were pretty quick to get to the -4 on environment. I'm curious, just being a bit of a pain in the butt, really, why not -5? What keeps them from the very bottom in your mind?
Mostly because it's indirect as opposed to the fossil fuel companies, which are direct. If it were a
Got it.
fossil fuel company, they'd be a -6, 7, 8.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So it's because they're indirect.
Got it.
I'm giving them a little bit of a break.
Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. Good to know. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And thank you for humoring that. And I'm going to swing us back into the next couple questions and then bring us to a close. And here we're going to go into a more sort of imaginative state. We're going to leave actual objective reality for just a moment and run a couple scenarios past you and see what you think. So the first one is this just in. There's been some news. You have been appointed in charge of the whole entire universe. You rule everything. Nothing is in the way and there are no limits. What would you change about this company?
Yeah, so I wrote a white paper a couple of years ago called 7 Bold Strokes to Save the World, which had a similar kind of premise.
Yeah.
If I were in charge of the world, what would I do without blinking an eye? Just because I know that these things would be the right things to do.
Yeah.
There were quite a variety of things in there, but some of them had to do with the financial system and what it is that we count and what it is we don't count. So from that point of view, from a banking point of view, I would have a public bank as opposed to private banks available in every jurisdiction in the world. In some jurisdictions, they used to be through the post office. In other jurisdictions, other mechanisms. The closest thing we've got to that in Canada is BDC, but that's not what I would call a public bank. It's a
Mm,
Crown Corp, but that's about it. And they are a bank. So I think that would be one thing, to have an alternative to the banking system for people to be able to have access to funds. There are a lot of monetary things that could and should be done, but there are people that are much more qualified than I am on that, Mark Anilski and a bunch of other brilliant people on that. But I think that I would, number one, have them be more public about their purpose, and govern themselves accordingly. Make sure that once they've got the purpose established, that they would ripple and embed that purpose in all of the governance related policies and strategies and all of that stuff, risk management, just to make sure that that's aligned with what it is that they do and how they do it. And then I would make sure that they were funding things which were taking us in the right direction, as opposed to a direction which is becoming increasingly dangerous.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay. While you're still in charge of the world, I just have a question. Can you say a little bit more about what is different with a public bank? So if I'm banking with a public bank, how is my banking experience different, either at the sort of retail individual level or the institutional level? And pardon my ignorance, I like the idea, and I realized, whoa, I've never even thought of that. What does that look and feel like?
Well, because you're not driven by profit, you're not going to be as inclined to invest the savings of people into things which are going to be extremely profitable, but not necessarily useful.
Got it.
Second thing is there's a better than even possibility that you can give zero interest loans, as opposed to requiring the generation of money from loans. Basically, banks are printing more money than the government prints, because every time they loan, they're basically creating money. So I would rather have the government in charge of that than a private bank.
Got it.
I would trust them more.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Well, alas, that scenario was fiction, and you are no longer in charge of the universe. It was very fun while it lasted. You can see why I invented this project for myself.
I thought it was too easy.
Live out my dreams. But new news has just come in that you have a direct line to the CEO of TD Bank, so to Bharat Masrani, and he really respects and believes in what you're thinking and doing, takes your calls. The thing is, he's super busy, so he's only got 30 seconds. What do you tell him?
So I would tell him that he's a very important actor in Canada, and he's a very important actor in the banking system. And there's a leadership opportunity here that it would be good for him to take advantage of. One of the opportunities is for him to show leadership on the issue that is basically an existential issue, and that's climate change. So he could model the way on all of the Mark Carney advice on what the financial community should be doing, and actually do it with interim targets and be very transparent about that. He should engage his board and his employees and his other stakeholders in redefining the purpose of the bank, and be able to show that changing that purpose to a more useful kind of framework would be incredibly successful for the bank. If the bank decided to do this, it would leave the others in its dust, because people would be attracted to it because their values resonate with the bank's values. I really think that there's an opportunity here that any bank that has the guts to do it would really find that it pays off. But it's going to take courage. I mean, it's different. It's different. It's a very different kind of thing. But if they decide to do it, banks are really good at executing. They could do it.
I love it. I hope he hears you. Well, thank you, Bob. That's the last of the questions I had prepared for us to talk about, but I wonder, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you want to make sure you say in relation to TD Bank, either contributing to or not undermining the future that you've described?
Yeah, it just comes back to what I was saying initially. I'm not trying to pick on TD Bank. It's a common issue with all of the Canadian banks, the big five, or it's more than that these days, but the original big five. It's a banking issue, and they are trapped in a mesh of their own making, and it's very hard to be able to break out of that mold and position themselves in a different way as an enabler of useful things. And I think the timing is good. I just wish that they and the other banks could partner on doing this. And if they can't partner on it, do it anyway.
I love it. Thank you very much, Bob Willard. Always a pleasure to talk to you and see you even virtually. Really appreciate your time and insights here.
Always a treat. Thank you.